collection and monitoring behavior. So we'll talk about a couple different types of data collection. We'll understand why consistent data drives better decisions, so why we want to take this data. And then we're going to identify tools and systems to support accurately tracking behavior. So, why it matters. Data collection is possibly the most important thing you will do when you're managing behavior, because if we have data on how often the behavior occurred prior to intervention, we know whether or not the intervention was successful, which, when we don't know that, it can be a huge waste of resources. It also can be, if you're using a more restrictive intervention, you might be putting the student through something that they just don't need to go through because that intervention isn't working. So, data collection is this hugely important thing that we always need to do prior to engaging in any sort of intervention. So, I'm going to talk about a couple different types. I'll talk about frequency, how often a behavior occurs, and then I'll talk about duration, how long a behavior lasts, and then I'll talk about latency, and then I'll also talk briefly about ABC data collection. Frequency is the most simple type of behavioral data collection. Frequency is simply a count of how often a behavior happens. We often call it a tally count. For example, if you're counting how many times a child calls out in class without raising their hand, it's just every time you see the child do it, it's a little tally count, and you're just doing a count of how often it occurs within the classroom setting. So, this is best with low to moderate frequency behaviors that do not occur often or too rarely. You need clear definitions and typically shorter behaviors. Examples of good behaviors to take frequency are things like asking for help, hitting, saying no, all really short, discrete behaviors. And then you want that low to moderate frequency to use it. Again, also taking data defines your problem better. A lot of times the teacher's like, he yells out in class, yells out answers, yells inappropriate comments, and that's some problem. So you're going to help her address it or help create an intervention to address that. When you go in and take data, say you take a little bit of data every subject, and you find out that he's doing that most during when the teacher is lecturing about math. That helps define the problems. One, you know where to implement your intervention. Two, it gives you a hint at why he might be doing that. It also really defines the problem. The teacher might have said, this is such a huge problem, it's happening all the time. But when you take the data, it's like, well, not quite. We still want to address it, but you know exactly when we need to address it. Taking data really clarifies the problem. Now, rate is when you take frequency and put a time element on it. Rate is typically taking your frequency count down to one of three things. It's usually minutes, hours, or days. And so if we'll just say Johnny's this kid who calls out. You observe Johnny over 3 different days, one time each. You observed him a total of 10 hours. He took a frequency count. One observation was 40 minutes, another was 30, another was 3 hours. More occurred in the 3-hour period and less in the 30-minute period. You found out he had 100 counts of calling out over 10 hours. To get 10 hours to 1, you would divide it by 10. And then you do the same thing to the amount of frequency counts you got. So you had 100 frequency count. You had 100 behaviors. So 100 divided by 10 is 10. So Johnny is calling out 10 times per hour. And now we have a rate that we can work with and continually derive to determine if your intervention is working. We use this when observation sessions are inconsistent. I observed an hour then, I observed 30 minutes, and it's different. I got different counts. When you need to compare behavior across days, this allows us to track efficient behavior change. Typically with this, you're either pulling it down to a 1-hour period, a 1-day period, or a 1 minute. It will depend on the situation, the behavior that you're observing. Sometimes behaviors are super long. And frequency doesn't really tell us what is going on. For example, we could have one tantrum a week, but that tantrum is between a 1 hour period and a 2 hour period. We'll call her Molly. So Molly just tantrums forever. If I walked in, took a frequency count, and I walked into a meeting or to the parents, I said, oh, she tantrums about once per week. Most of the team would be like, well, that's, if she's a young kid, young kids sometimes just have tantrums, everyone would be like, well, that's not really a problem. That should be okay. Maybe we don't need any more behavioral intervention. But if you told the duration, it lasts a whole hour. So she's losing a whole hour of learning every week. That becomes more of a problem. So there's occasions when we want duration rather than frequency on a behavior. To take duration, you start the stopwatch when the behavior starts and you stop it when it ends, and that time is your duration. If you're taking good duration on, tantrums throughout the week, you also get frequency because every time you started and stopped would be one count. Behavior, why you want to use it? You want to use it when the length matters more than the frequency. So it's more important than how often it occurs. It tracks behaviors with meaningful duration. So good for measuring things like tantrums, engagement, screaming episodes. You might want to consider duration. And it provides good data for how long these behaviors occur. So latency is the time between a cue and the start of a behavior. So most of the time we're using this for reaction time. Sometimes we use it for prompt dependence, but it's most useful for tracking compliance. When you get the teacher or whatever situation where they say they're just not following directions, you want to look at a latency. So the time that someone gives the direction to the time the person engages in the behavior is what we're most interested in. And sometimes the behavior never occurs, so that's a data point in itself. But typically you want to look at when the behavior occurred. A lot of times you think there's non-compliance, but it's just a delay. So what you do behaviorally is you try to get that latency smaller and smaller so they follow directions a lot faster. So it's typically a measure of compliance. We're learning how long it takes someone to respond to a prompt. Once you're taking latency, you're going to reduce delays in response, and then you're tracking hesitation and processing time. I'm a school psych, so I do assessment as well, and I have used this to determine if there's some processing issues going on. Unless you're doing assessment, it's not useful in that way. You're really going to use it for that non-compliance. ABC. While you're taking this frequency or duration data, you also want to see if you can jot down a little bit of ABC because ABC is going to tell you what the function of the behavior is. I highly, highly recommend getting more training in this area. Taking good ABC data can really change lots of things for somebody working with kids with behavioral problems. Okay, so Johnny's calling out, right? And so you're there taking your low frequency count, and when you're able to, you go to that ABC data sheet, which will have antecedent behavior and consequence, just like the picture there. And you write down what happened right before the behavior. For example, the teacher was writing on the board, you write the behavior, Johnny calls out. Be pretty clear on that when you're taking data. You know what behaviors you're observing. And then you write the consequence. All the peers laughed. Let's say Johnny made a fart joke. All the peers laughed. Then another behavior happens and the teacher is reading from the text. Johnny makes a joke about someone's hair and all the peers laugh. You start seeing the patterns of what's happening right after. You kind of see Johnny might really like peer attention. That's why he's engaging in this behavior. He keeps getting peer attention from it, and that can teach you what to do for your intervention. So same with our little girl who's tantruming, Molly. So Molly keeps tantruming in class. First, you write what happened before. Someone put some math problems in front of Molly. She tantrums. She tantrums for a whole hour. By the time she's done, math is over. She never had to do the math. The math is taken away. The next day, someone puts a math problem in front of her. She tantrums. They take the math away. They just try to calm her. They take her to the occupational therapy room to play with the swing or whatever. So you can see she's tantruming so she doesn't have to do the math. I'm not saying you should force her to do the math. There's other things we can do besides forcing someone to engage in math. But that tells you exactly what the purpose of that behavior is, and it will tell you what the intervention is. So you'll have an idea of how much the behavior is occurring and why the behavior is occurring. And from that point, you can usually pick some pretty effective interventions. Why is this so important? It helps us with database decision making. It helps us track progress towards goals. It prevents over reliance on memory. I can't tell you how many times I'm like, how much is that occurring? And someone's like, I think it occurs a lot. I think is not the best. It's better if you can collect the data. It helps team collaboration. When you have this picture of exactly what's happening, you can really collaborate together better. It protects students' rights by documenting the needs and outcomes. So we know when there's a behavioral problem and when there isn't. Lots of times, teacher referral or whatnot, and I go in and observe, and it's just not as severe as a teacher stating, and they probably don't need the level of behavioral support that that teacher wants to give them. It's better to give them, based on their needs, not based on what everybody thinks they need. Tools, we can do paper forms and clipboards. You can write it on a piece of paper, but there are a lot of papers out there. Find the school psychologists or BCBAs you may work with. They have forms for all this. So just ask them. I happily give my resources to people. Most people in my field do. You could make it yourself. There's a lot of free stuff online, but you can also pay minimal fees for stuff on Teachers Pay Teachers. If you need some forms to collect data. There's data tracking apps. Those are a little more expensive, but they're good. When I started, that didn't exist. We were all paper. But there's definitely, and those will create graphs for you automatically. They do all the work. You could also ask your NPS or NPA to invest in some for you and other staff members. And then you can use spreadsheets where you get timestamps and all that on the computer. That also can be useful. Okay, so we talked about good behavior support begins with good data collection. You want to choose the right data type based on the behavior you're interested in, and you want to collect data consistently and clear, and then observing what's going on does support the intervention process and will help your students.